And here we are. We think we're broadcasting with Nina Simon here in Boston at District Hall and exploring the topic of museums and relevance. And so what's going to happen is that we're going to have about half an hour or so. Nina can talk for about 5 minutes, and then we'd like to open it up for questions. And we also have a panel of people close by here. Actually, anyone can come up. And we'll get another chair here. You can either sit down and ask a question or ask it from afar and we'll repeat the question, where we have another mic we can run around. But welcome, Nina. So, you know, if you're up for it, we'd maybe talk a few minutes about where you are, what you're thinking about museums and relevance, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm getting a little bit of weird sound feedback. Are you guys?
Nope, that's good.
Okay, here's what we're gonna do. If anything weird happens, I might not know, and so I would like you at that point to do the wave or like a I'm drowning signal or something so that I can see and I can stop talking. We can figure this out. Thanks so much for having me. I look forward to us getting into the discussion part of this because I know it's fundamentally weird that you're looking at a screen, and it's fundamentally weird that I'm sitting in an office at my museum, but I'm excited to be with you in this way. I was asked to join you guys to talk a little bit about some of the ideas behind this new book, The Art of Relevance, but specifically as it relates to this idea of the distributed museum. Just to briefly give you a little bit of context, I've been curious for a long time about why so often I'll be at a conference or an event and somebody in the very beginning, very important person, will stand up and will say, we have to be relevant. But then that statement is not always followed up with a sense of what that means or why that matters. And so I became really curious in this question of what is relevance for? What does it do for us? How do we get beyond this idea that relevance is about what's trending or what's hot to really think about how it can impact what matters in our own institutions? As many of you know, I run a small museum of art and history here on the other coast in Santa Cruz, California. And we've been thinking about this issue a lot as we have worked very hard over the last few years to go from being on the brink of closure to engaging more people and more diverse people in our community. So very briefly, the working definition that I've been using of relevance is that relevance is a key that unlocks meaning. It's not the meaning itself, but if you imagine the meaning, the power of what you do, living inside a room, there are doors to that room, and people who are insiders who come all the time, they have keys, they know how to open that door, no problem. But for people who don't have keys, all they see is a locked door, and they don't know that there's meaning on the other side. And so for those people, relevance is the key that unlocks that door to connect them to the meaning or the value within. And so, you know, in the terms of the distributed museum, I've been thinking about this and about this question of where does that meaning live? And the answer is that, of course, this meaning doesn't just live in the rooms of our physical buildings, our museums. It lives all over our communities, in rooms with different doors, different greeters, different contexts, different doormats. And I think that as we think about what it means to be a distributed museum, it's not about having a museum empire that's monolithic, but it's about being part of creating meaning in lots of different parts of our communities, in lots of different ways, in rooms that may open to different people for different reasons. And so one of the things that I've really focused on around relevance is this idea of going outside your building to understand what feels welcoming for somebody else. And just a few weeks ago, I was in St. Paul at a museum that had a cop in the lobby. And I asked them, why do you have a cop in your lobby? And they said, well, we've done some visitor research and some studies and seen that family visitors feel more safe and more welcome if there's a cop in the lobby. And I said to them, you know, I'm pretty sure you're trying to reach some other people in your community in St. Paul for whom this thing that you may think is a sign of welcome may be a big old keep out sign. And I'm always looking for these questions of who are our rooms for, who feels welcome in there, who feels that the content or the ways we're inviting them in are relevant, and what other kinds of constituencies and opportunities are there out in the community. So I would really suggest that for us to think about a distributed museum doesn't start by thinking about how we can program other spaces or do outreach, but thinking about how we can go outside as participants, as listeners, as learners in other people's spaces, so that we can really understand where does meaning live in this community, for whom, how could we be a part of meaning in other places, in other contexts that aren't ours, where can we create new rooms or new opportunities for meaning, and where can't we? And I want to share 3 examples very briefly of different kinds of ways of approaching this. All these examples are ones I was honored to learn about in this book. The first is Cornerstone Theater, not a museum, a theater company where every single theater project they do, they come up with a topic and they work with partners around that topic in a particular community to co-create a play about that topic. So when they were doing a play about AIDS and African Americans in LA, they worked with African American churches and with AIDS and gay man related groups in LA. When they were working on projects around the Grapes of Wrath and ag, they worked across different ag communities in the West. In the case of Cornerstone Theater, their perspective is we are a distributed theater company, and that means we have no home. We are always a guest. We are always entering somebody else's community, and we are always learning from people in that community about how to create meaning in their context, in their place. So that's kind of the ultimate distributed model of no home guest model. Then you have the Laundromat Project, an organization I really admire in New York, where they say we are going to create art and run art-making programs with people in community places that are already places where, in their case, they were talking about low-income people of color already come together to gather, and those places are laundromats. The Laundromat Project works with artists in laundromats across Manhattan, in fact, across all the boroughs of New York, to create opportunities for art festivals, art making, art workshops in spaces that are already community spaces. So this is the distributed model where you have pre-existing rooms that open for certain people, are relevant to certain people, and you're inviting new meaning into those spaces. And I think even what you guys are doing tonight, having this Museumhive in District Hall, or whether it's a pub science event, or any time when we think about how do we join somebody else's constituency and bring some of our content in, that's a second kind of distributed model. Now the third and final example I'll share, and then we'll just open it up, is one that we've been doing here at our museum, which is called Pop-Up Museum. We've been very interested in this problem that as more and more community groups in our county, in Santa Cruz, want to get involved with the museum, they constantly ask us, what are you doing in this neighborhood? What are you doing in Live Oak? What are you doing in the mountains? And we wanted a way to answer that wasn't just about saying no or having specific programs in particular areas. So we created this platform called Pop-Up Museum, which was a way for anybody to create a museum at any time, on any theme, in any place. And for us, this is an approach of kind of a ceding authority version of a distributed museum, where we're basically saying to people, here's an infrastructure by which you can use some museum-ish stuff to add value and add meaning in a space that's yours, in a community and at a time and place that works for you. So I just thought that those 3 examples might be an interesting framing as we think about what does it mean to be distributed, and how do we get beyond the idea that it's about colonizing other spaces in our community to an idea that it's about learning from, being a guest of, being in partnership, or being in service to the other parts of our community where there is a desire or an opportunity for our meaning and our value to connect with the meaning and the communities that are out there. So I'm going to leave it at that. Happy to answer whatever questions you have. I see that there are a lot on Twitter, but I'm going to leave it to the people with the mic to figure out what we should do. The only question I would love is if you are going to ask something and you're live there, that you go to an area sort of between Ed's arm and the aisle so that I can at least see you. That would be really nice. Thank you.
So we're getting some echo from some, but I think we're good now. This one is off. So okay, good. Thank you.
Question 1.
Hi, Nina.
Hey.
My name is Adrienne. I work at the Power of Your House in Boston. Great thoughts. My question is, let's talk about the distributed museum in a very place-rooted institution, like a historic house museum, like the Power of Your House. very rooted in Boston, in New England. The structure itself is part of our collections. Just a question that popped up as you were talking.
Yeah. So tell me, before you give away that mic, why be distributed, or what would the desire in the Paul Revere House's context be to have a presence that is not strictly place-based to that historic location?
So off the top of my head, I might say the story of the United States, the story of innovation as it pertains to entrepreneurs, business people, like Paul Revere was, how European colonists interact with people who were here before us, questions of that nature.
Okay, so great, thank you. So what I'm hearing is that you feel like you guys have some content or some themes or some meaning to bring to other kinds of contexts and conversations beyond your place. I think that that's particularly acute for place-based institutions like historic houses, but I think it's actually true for all of us in that I think a lot of organizations, we often start by talking about the community we serve is local. You know, that's certainly true in our case here in Santa Cruz. And I think that while that is one frame, you know, the community we serve are the people who come to our site or who are here in this space. Another frame, which was kind of brought up by what you were just elaborating on, would be that our community is conceptual. And I think about entities like the Sierra Club, or really, you know, when you think about political movements, so much of what's happening on the national political level is this sense of I'm part of a community, right? I'm part of Trump Nation, or I'm with her. And those kinds of messages are not place-bound messages, but they create the sense of affiliation with a community that may be bigger than a particular place. Now, you know, for example, you brought up innovation. I live near Silicon Valley, and there's an argument that, you know, there are certain ideas that are more credibly linked to certain places than others, right? There's a reason the Tech Museum is in Silicon Valley and the Boston Museum of Science has a different frame. And so I think that place matters and can be very valuable, but it's not necessarily a limiter on how we think about distribution. There's no question in my mind, though, if you're thinking about distribution on a broader level than a region or a county or an area, you have to be thinking digital and not just you know, place-based or person or real life-based in terms of how you're distributing that meaning or that experience.
Anyone else?
Can we answer? Yeah.
I'm from the Museum of Science. My question is, at least from the descriptions that you gave of the 3 examples, they all felt like they still had a physical manifestation in some way. And I was wondering if there is a successful example of a purely digital distributed experience or museum.
I think great question. I think there definitely are. I mean, a lot of institutions are doing so, whether it's like the huge Wikimedia stuff that's going on, or, you know, if you think about, I was just in Chicago with the woman who runs Brain Scoop for the Field Museum, and it's clear on YouTube that they, you know, have really cultivated this huge community internationally. Frankly, that's not a world that I understand or work in that often because A, my work nowadays is so physically oriented, and B, I work in a smaller community where there's this real sense of we want to be connected to each other, and our mission value at our institution has really become about how do we build a stronger and more connected community here in Santa Cruz County. So to be honest, I think there are probably other people in the room who may have better answers on that truly distributed side. But obviously there are tons of examples that are non-museum examples, and I think maybe an interesting question is, why, what kinds of organizations, forgetting, you know, what their focus is or what their field is, what industries are doing that well, and why aren't museum projects necessarily going as far as they could in being real leaders in that regard? And one of my guesses is that even though there have been some networked projects across multiple institutions, we are still pretty hidebound in talking about my institution versus your institution. And so there isn't, I think, often that platform network effect that can really happen in other kinds of environments where we see distributed experiences working a lot better. But I think that looking at where are people doing this really well, and how can we be part of that? I've been really interested looking at podcasts and how how the world of podcasts is starting to aggregate into different kinds of clusters, and there are some that are becoming more traditional media clusters, and there are others that are more like a networked alliance. But just thinking about, okay, how are distributed kind of meaning makers in other contexts doing this, and and I think in many cases the fact that they don't have physical presences and large staffs and large infrastructures is making it easier for them to say, we've got to be distributed, we've got to be a network to do this, as opposed to saying, oh, we'll do it ourselves.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think your example, Emily Grassley from the Field Museum, is a good one because she actually started off doing the Brain Scoop video podcast when she was at her previous museum as a volunteer, and the Field Museum actually poached her on the basis of her success running her little video podcast to work as their chief curiosity correspondent, I think is her title at the Field Museum.
Right. Yep.
For people who are interested, I'd say Mike Edson's essay on dark matter, if you want to Google that, it has plenty of examples of the potential of reaching scales that are sort of beyond fathoming if you work in museums. Any other questions?
I wanted to respond to, there's a person, Elizabeth Nevins, who I want to shout out for giving a lot of love on Twitter as part of this experience. And she's had some interesting comments and questions here on Twitter about what's the motivation to change, and are we collectively who are here today the change makers or the disruptors, or why might we change in this direction? In our case at my museum, I always root from the perspective that I was brought in to run a museum that was literally about to close its doors. And I do think that somebody once said to me, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And I do believe that when you have the urgency of whether it be a financial crisis, whether it be a crisis of relevance that nobody's coming or the wrong people are coming, that can be incredibly activating to move towards change. I actually, one of the things I've been most disturbed by is the extent to which, when we talk about community engagement or engaging new people in museums or even this distributed museum context, that we often really frame it as totally in terms of cost, like, oh, this is a social mission, we do this because we think it would be the right thing to do to engage new people, but we know it's just going to cost us money. In our case, at our museum, there was a strong business reason where we had to engage new people. We had to engage younger people, people of color, people who hadn't historically come to our museum, because we were not financially viable without them. And frankly, I've been talking to people all over the world who are in museums, theaters, historic sites, libraries, parks, that are really struggling right now with this question of, do we matter enough in this community to continue to be funded, to continue to be supported? And I see that that crisis is often what's spurring the change. And one of the things I'm super interested in is, how do you engender opportunities for change before you're at that crisis point when you're about to close the doors? And I actually think the hardest challenge that institutions have is when they kind of see that problem out on the horizon, but the pain is not acute yet. And so you have to cultivate the urgency. And I've been particularly curious about this talking and working with people in national parks, where national parks are having booming attendance all over the country, and a lot of challenges actually associated with that, but also a sense that the people who are coming to the parks are not reflective fully of our country. And so they're trying to figure out, how should we change at a time when we're doing so well from an attendance perspective, but we're not doing so well from a representing our country perspective. So I think when it comes to change, it's really valid to say, if you don't feel that you need to change or have to change, don't. But if you feel like there is urgency there, or that you need to cultivate urgency because there's some need to be more relevant, to matter more in some way, then you absolutely should.
All right. Next question, Brendan?
Up to the table, please.
Yeah.
It's really hard to share your screen. It should.
Hey Nina, Brendan at QZM. I have a question. What role do you think public art plays in this idea of the distributed museum? I look at the Peabody Essex bringing the Strand Beast to various neighborhoods. I look at the ICA curating on the Greenway, or look at the MIT list curating on the Greenway, and other institutions spreading their collection or spreading their works geographically across their cities, across nations. I was in Panama City and I experienced the Prado walking around. Like, it's an incredible opportunity, I think, but I'd be curious what you think about public art and the responsibility from major institutions to participate in public art.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question and something we're doing a lot of in Santa Cruz as well. Yes, I think that, look, you want to be, in a lot of cases, the reason we want to distribute is because we feel like a limited number of people are choosing to come to where we are, and we want to go where people are. So I think that the public art side is really beautiful. I think it's interesting to think about which communities are we bringing that to, in which ways. And I think one thing I've been surprised by actually working with public art is that there is an extent to which, and I hear this in what you're talking about with Panama City, there's an extent to which when you experience art in a public place, it feels more collectively owned than it does when you experience it in an institutional space. And I think one of the reasons we have been moving so urgently and quickly towards programming beyond our building is a sense that when our mission lives inside, it's a beautiful thing for the people who are inside, but there's very little like bystander effect. But when you can program out in public, and public art obviously is a version of that, there are some people who will deeply engage with the work, but there are some people who will just kind of, as they're walking down the street, feel that it feels a little differently because there's all that art there, and they may not even directly engage. And they would not feel that way walking by the blank exterior wall of a museum, even though there's a lot of art just on the other side of that wall. And so I think that one of the things that is beautiful about programming outside, programming in free, public, outdoor spaces, is this sense that there can be multiple levels of engagement, including for a lot of people who didn't choose to, quote, walk into that room, but for whom the art came to a context that they were coming through anyway. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you, and I think we should do more and more of it. And I think that if you were given the choice to take over, say, a building where you could do exactly what you wanted, but people would have to come inside, versus doing a little less of what you wanted, but doing it in a free public outdoor space, I'd choose the latter every time because of the a huge positive impact you can have. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I got a quick follow.
Yeah, sure. Dan.
Hey, Nina, hi, Dan from the. So I've had this fantasy about, yeah, all right. Bookmobiles and food trucks.
Yeah, yeah.
Why are we not museum mobiles and museum trucks taking our stuff? Have you had any experience? Are there examples of any of that happening anywhere?
Yeah, absolutely. The Oakland Museum does that. They have a cart. There are a couple of museums I know that have souped up bikes, I absolutely agree with you. I think that the idea of being mobile, the idea of, being where people are, and being able to, experiment with being in different places makes a lot of sense. I also, like the pop-up museum, I'm always looking for what are those examples that people can take on themselves and make real. And one of the examples I love that's in physical space is the little free libraries. I'm sure you've probably seen one of these somewhere. They are in neighborhoods, these like little boxes for books, and people in those neighborhoods will just stick books in there, and they're free to use, and they're not facilitated by libraries at all. It's just people usually on private property, sometimes in their neighborhood, erecting one of these little boxes. And there's a sense that not only can you participate with it, but if you get excited about it, you could make your own too, and you could add it to the map, and you could be adding to that meaning happening up there. So I wonder, how do we get from the food truck, museum truck version where, okay, maybe a museum could have its one truck or its one bike or its one cart, to something that's more like the little free library or the pop-up museum, whereas other people say, wow, I want to be part of that too. They can, for example, like on the bike example, we've done some experimenting with spoke cards, which is kind of this like if you're in a super biker culture, people will stick these cards in the spokes of their bike. And the idea is that, anybody could soup up their bike with some of these cards if they wanted to. And so what are those ways to invite people to also make it their own and to do some of the distributing themselves, as opposed to it always being institutionally driven? But yeah, Dan, I think you should, build that cart. And frankly, from a NEMA perspective, you could have a NEMA cart and you could have a different museum in a different neighborhood. Different museums could rent it for a week at a time from you if you wanted to.
All right, I'm going to come back to that. But first, we have another question.
Yeah. Other questions?
Hi, Nina. How are you?
Hey.
My name is Alicia from Boston Children's Museum. So I have a question about, are there any suggestions you have around ways to turn this relevance lens internally? Because I feel, as you mentioned before, oftentimes when we speak about this is in this kind of othering kind of sense about communities, but also how do we look at our institutional practices and systems and some of the ways of being that may actually be counterintuitive to some of this other relevance work. Like, we always hear about diversity, but traditionally the workforce doesn't often reflect the communities that we serve.
Yeah.
So
Amen.
how do we begin to turn this relevance lens internally and not just externally?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for asking that. And I think that it absolutely starts within. And frankly, a lot of what I played with in the book with this central metaphor around this room is this idea that there are insiders and outsiders, and that working on relevance really means cultivating empathy for people who are outsiders. And often the most entrenched and most protectionist insiders are staff or longtime volunteers or trustees who really love the room as it is. And sometimes we have to work on awareness around our blind spots, the cop in the lobby kind of situation, or things that we're so proud of that we think of as like cornerstone institutional practice, but are really keeping people out. A simple example of that, from the Park Service, park rangers are really proud of the park ranger uniform and the flat hat and the badge. And I was talking to this guy, Cam Juarez, who was recently hired in Tucson, Arizona. He was the first community organizer ever hired by the Park Service. And he was hired specifically to work with the Saguaro National Park in their involvement and engagement with local Latino communities. And he, one of the first things he said was, look, for my community, Latinos living on the border, this uniform and this flat hat that you all are so proud of, it does not look like a welcome, come on in sign to me. And are we willing to consider taking something that has been what we consider to be a cornerstone of being a ranger and change this if it's causing some people to not feel welcome? I've seen a lot of work, and I think, as you pointed out, we've got to start the work on the inside. And there are simple ways to do it that don't have to be impossible or don't have to go right to who are we hiring. But I think that finding ways to cultivate empathy. So, doing some mapping of where do we as a community of staff members spend our time when we're outside of work. We actually did this early on at our museum. We literally drew on a map, where are the top 5 places that you go? And we noticed there's some neighborhoods none of us go to. And some of those neighborhoods are neighborhoods that we talk about a lot as communities we would like to engage in our programming. Maybe we should be spending some time as guests in those neighborhoods, going to those restaurants, going to those events, getting to know people so that we're not fetishizing or otherizing these people in a neighborhood who we don't really know or engage with. And so I think that's kind of step one, is how do you be a guest? How do you have awareness of your blind spots and start to practice empathy and being a guest in somebody else's space? Then for us, the big step two has been, how do you cultivate the partnerships there? How do you learn how to listen when it's those partners who say, hey, we don't feel welcome when you're doing X or wearing Y? And then for us, step 3 has really been around hiring and changing our staffing practices and setting, in our case, we have 2 very specific goals at our museum. On the participant side, we say we want our participants to reflect the age, income, and ethnic diversity of our county. and on the staff side that we want to represent the ethnic diversity of our county. And so we've really worked on those two things, and I think those are imperfect as measures, but they at least give us some clear sense of here's what good looks like for us, and it's not just about trying, it's about doing this kind of representing, involving, and empathizing, and really turning a lens on who do we partner with. Even things like we've learned there are certain communities where when we were getting into a place where we were always emailing with people to set up partnerships, we found that there were certain groups we worked with where that was really not their preferred mode of communication. And we had to learn, you got to pick up the phone with people who live in that neighborhood or do this kind of job or whatever it might be, and not say that email has to be the way that this communication has to work.
All right, other questions? All right, I'm going to jump in then. So I'd like to ask a follow-up question to the pop-up / little free library model.
Yeah.
The ones that I have seen that really work well are ones that have happened pretty much completely outside of the museum world or even the larger GLAM world. They are essentially grassroots efforts. And the question of authority and being able to cede authority enough to let that kind of grassroots stuff flourish seems like a really hard thing for museums in general to do. So any thoughts you have on how to cultivate the mindset that makes it okay to propose things that involve having no authority, no editorial oversight, no moderation, any of the things that we generally spend a huge amount of our time worrying about?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a conversation that's been going on for, 10 years, 15 years, right, around this participatory stuff. I mean, I do think that when it comes to those kinds of grassroots projects, certainly, let's not abscond the opportunity to engage. And I do think that there are kind of questions of how could we institutionally really be springboards for a lot more of something to happen that otherwise might happen a little bit or might run into some chronic problems. So, for example, I think about how the Queen's Museum, which is a real leader in a lot of social practice work, they did this thing in a plaza project where there were a lot of mostly Salvadorian cart vendors. And so they worked with some artists in residence and paired them up with cart vendors to be able to make their carts more beautiful. Basically, there's some particular name for this thing, and I forget what it is. But anyway, there the museum was serving as a and saying, we are not going to accession these objects. We're not going, if an artist and a vendor want to do something that wasn't brokered through us, fine. But we see that we have an opportunity to broker to broker something that could make more art happen in this community, and that's from our perspective a good thing. And so I think similarly, like with something like Little Free Library, or I think about Strand Beast, what's the version of a workshop that happens at the museum where a whole lot of people are making something, and instead of saying to them, great, you made something, take it home and put it on your fridge or put it in your house, you're saying to them, put it on your mailbox. How would we make a workshop slightly different if we were encouraging people then to use those things in public in some way? Or, where do we see a project maybe that we really like and are excited about, and we realize, a springboard factor for this could be money, or it could be a conversation with Public Works about X. We actually recently did an experimental project in our county with the bus, the metro people, where we did the first ever, our bus stops in Santa Cruz County, they don't have any advertising, they don't have any signage on them at all. And so we did an exhibit in a bus stop, and it was the first time something like that happened. And there's now a conversation going on about, should the MA, our museum, do bus stops everywhere? Or should we and Metro together kind of facilitate a process that helps there be more artful and more historically motivated bus stops? And I guess that at least in my institution, our mission and our goal is not around arbitrating the quality or the content. Our mission is to use art and history to build a more connected community. And if we want to do that, we want as much of it to happen as possible. And so I think that, you have to be able to weigh, how much leverage and spread and mission impact can I get, and how much pain is that going to take? And I think, unfortunately, often the way we structure these shared authority projects, there's both a lot of pain and not a lot of, you know, leverage platform potential. And so I think that like it's legitimate to think about, okay, there is going to be pain here, especially if we're going to flex new muscles. How is it going to get us somewhere we couldn't get with a regular program? Because if you could get there with a regular program or with your regular approach, you're always going to choose that because it's just going to feel easier and you're going to feel more assured that you can have a quality product. But if you don't know how to do it with your regular stuff, then I feel like there's a different opportunity there.
Yeah, great, thank you. Especially the idea of pain being an inevitable part of the process, I think, is a useful thing. That was one of the first things that Judy Randover taught me about the inability to not have pain if you're doing something creative. You know, she said very early on, you can have your pain now or you can have your pain later. You can't not have it. And the longer you wait, the worse it will be. So you might as well have as much pain up front as you possibly can. And I think that becomes a huge issue, certainly in my museum, of trying to avoid pain as a way of moderating, you know, just surviving the day-to-day work, getting past that huge issue.
And you know, I get those kinds of questions all the time, kind of about like change, especially with insiders, longtime staff, or whatever it might be. And we focus really on three things for this. One is appealing to people's generosity, that sense of, hey, we love this stuff in this room. We love the meaning that's here. Don't you want to share it with more people? So that's kind of the generosity argument. Then there's a bravery argument. So acknowledging, wow, you're really being courageous in trying this because this is new and this is scary. And I actually do that a lot. Some people do that a lot with staff. I do that a lot with donors. You know, at donor events, I will literally congratulate people in the room. Thank you for having the courage to support us spreading art and history in totally different ways in our community. And then the third thing is, if it's really not working, somebody who runs a ballet theater once told me this great phrase, bless and release. Like, if it's really not working, don't cause both of yourselves so much pain forever. You know, find a way to say, I'm really sorry that this project or this institution isn't bringing value to you anymore. I hope you can find a place where you can really contribute in a way that's going to feel great for you. And I have not had to do that as much with staff, but I've certainly done it with volunteers and donors. And I will say on the first two, on the generosity and bravery, you know, somebody who's confronting the change and is uncomfortable about it, they may not feel generous in that moment about shared authority. They may not feel brave in that moment when they're feeling fear. But I do believe that those are kind of attributes that we all aspire to. And so if we can appeal, instead of saying, hey, you're resisting the change and you're lame and we're going to fight about it, to be able to appeal to their you know, generous self, their most brave self, to be part of it is awesome. And then, you know, to be real about acknowledging sometimes, you know what, this isn't going to work. Let's not fight about it anymore. Let's all find better ways to spend our time.
Okay, great. Next question? Two more, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Hi, Nina. So I guess my question is about ways museums can be more supportive of people that just have good ideas. So this summer I went to a week called Fet Forward in Boston, and it was kind of like discussing ways that it was just pretty much about like third culture people from the Atlantic, and so the event was called Navigating the Transatlantic. And it was just pretty much about like Caribbean culture and Carnival and things like that. So one conversation we ended up having was about how Carnival kind of mirrors a like performance art, and also is like kind of like a participatory event.
Yeah.
The way that you're talking about, because I actually read that book when I was in school. So yeah, so we talked a lot about that. So I guess my question is kind of how can museums just be supportive of people with good ideas? Because a lot of the things that you kind of spoke to were things that people were already doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's your name? I didn't catch your name.
Sierra.
Oh, nice to see you, Sierra. Awesome. Great question. And I think that there's, I think one of the most important things that we can be is facilitators for, and really being a platform for others to step into their own power in our space. We actually at our museum, we have this theory of change about what we're trying to accomplish, and the two outcomes we really focus on are social bridging, so bringing people together across differences, and then empowerment. So we don't focus on learning as our individual outcome goal. We focus on this idea of being empowered. And so we really believe that we're successful when you walk out the door ready to make art or make history in our community. And one of the ways we do that is by empowering a lot of different creative agents in our community to be the people on stage at our space, and for our staff to serve as the community organizers, the festival organizers, the people behind the scenes who are kind of coordinating to invite those collaborators to step into their own power. So I think we see like, okay, we have some assets, and our assets are physical, they're staff-wise, they're financial, they're programmatic somewhat, they're collection, but it would be, we actually choose not to have staff who do all the programming. We choose to have staff whose job is to make space and be facilitators and invite creative collaborators in to do their programming in our space. And I would say that especially when it comes to kind of culturally rooted programming, I think it's super important for museums not to become kind of culturally appropriative colonizers of others' cultural space. And so, for example, like we've had a Dia de los Muertos festival for a long time that the museums run. And, when I came to them, I was pretty uncomfortable with how that was run, because even though a ton of families, both white and Latino, came, it was run by white staff who were working with collaborators who were not rooted in a Mexican or a community Oaxacan background. And it, even though it was from a kind of experiential perspective a great event, it was not a great event from the perspective of empowering people in our community whose cultural practice we were putting on display. And so one of the things we've really worked on with that event is how do we shift to a backseat role of, yeah, we have a space, we have an ability to convene, we have ability to bring a lot of families here, but we don't want to be the leaders of this event. We don't want to get the props for it. We don't want to get the money for it. We want to be able to support, in our case, this local Oaxacan organization, Senderos, taking the lead. It took us a few years to get from a place of the MA runs this, to Senderos is a collaborator, to Senderos and the MA are partners, to Senderos is the leader. There's actually one other event in town, a Holy Festival, which is an Indian paint throwing festival. We had run a Holy Festival for a couple of years in partnership with some Indian student groups on UCSC campus. And then they came to us and said, we really want to do a Holy event at a different time of year in a different way. And we said, fine, we're not going to do it anymore, because you guys are the people who should run this event, not us. And so I think there's also this whole, especially when it comes to culturally rooted work, this whole concept of nothing about us without us is really important. And I think even getting to the point that, that without us, that what does that with look like? And how are we inviting creative producers, cultural change agents to step into their own power in our space? In the same way that we would afford to the artists we put on exhibit, for example, and how do we not take that power for ourselves?
Great. Okay, we have time for 2 more quick questions. We're going to do, I will stand in for Twitter. Monica on Twitter asks, but then why is attendance the only measure of success? And then we'll have 1 more question from Matt in the audience. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I don't think attendance is the only measure of success. I think that I'll say in our organization's case, we were way, we knew that people didn't even know our museum existed. So in the beginning, we focused on attendance. Let's just get more bodies here. And then after a couple of years, after we doubled our attendance, we started saying, which people are coming here? And then we started shifting to this idea that was focused on representation. Now we're shifting to focus a little more on, okay, now we've got the numbers and we've got the representation, what's the impact? And so I think that at different times an organization may have different focuses. When it comes to relevance in particular, I think that attendance is a good first line measuring stick of like, did this make a connection for somebody? Did they want to go through that door? But then the question of, did they find meaning on the other side of that door? Do they want their own key so they can come in again and again? That's not based on one-time attendance. That's going to be based on deeper engagement. And so I think that there is, in our case, what we've done is we've said we care about attendance, but we also care about how many visitors convert to becoming partners and collaborators in our programming, whether that means being a volunteer or a member or bringing your own creative practice into the museum. But that's what we see as you saying, I want and I'm seeking deeper meaning here. I'm also say that with distributed work, I think this debate comes up a ton because there's always this conversation about, well, the people who were outside, we went to that community festival and we talked with a ton of people from that community, but then none of those people came to our museum. So is that good? Because at that other site, we engage people who don't come to our museum, so we're distributing our involvement with people in our community? Or is that bad because our ultimate goal is to convert people to come to the museum? And I think one of the biggest questions about this distributed museum stuff is like, how important is mothership? And is the path always from that the reason we go out is to bring people in, or is the reason we go out because we know there are some people who will never come in our building and we need to be serving those people too, even if they're not going to show up? And that's a debate we have at our museum a lot too, in terms of why are we in these certain places and what do we consider to quote unquote count when we're talking about making relevant connections or unlocking meaning in our community.
Cool, thank you. Last question.
Hey.
Hi, Nina. How are you?
Good.
Matt Kirkman, a local independent consultant in museum planning and exhibition development. And I think you may have just answered my question because when I look around at the local audience here, I see a lot of exhibition people. So terms like pop-up or distributed or museum truck, those kinds of terms are not compatible with what we think of as permanent exhibition programming.
Sure.
So I'm wondering if you can comment on the intersection of permanence, the idea of distribution, and relevance, if you think there is an intersection of those ideas.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a good question. I started out in exhibits, and look, think about how weird, imagine you pitched a movie to a movie producer this way. You said, okay, we are going to spend a ton of time and a ton of money, and we are going to make this movie. But we're only going to let people in this certain location see it, and after 3 months or 2 years or 5 years, depending on the institution, we're going to just destroy all of it, and we'll just keep some photographs and some binders. Like, that is our model right now for exhibition. Or maybe we'll distribute it by sending it on the road. But especially now that I'm a smaller museum, I'm so sensitive to the fact that we make a new exhibit at my museum 8 times a year. None of those exhibits travel. None of them go anywhere afterwards. And we just stop, it just goes away. Like, that is so, so wasteful, right? And so I think that when we think about distribution, I think there's a real interesting question about, like, how can we better distribute the products that we're already creating? Because frankly, we're in a wasteful industry on the exhibition side in that way. And I think that, on the other hand, you were saying, these kind of models are antithetical to exhibit design. I actually think a lot of the things we've been talking about, whether they be pop-up museums or little free libraries or carts, they still involve a lot of physical infrastructure. And in at least my institution, a lot of our growth has been on the programmatic side. And we have functionally become an event-driven museum, and sometimes people will say, wow, it's just like a community center down there. There's all different, every night there's a different event. And I'm like, yes, thank you. That's what we exist to do. And frankly, from an efficiency perspective, as a director, it's a heck of a lot less wasteful for me. Like, I can, from an event perspective, like last week, we had, an ACLU working session on homelessness. We had a Buddhist wedding. We had a fire festival. We had a plant thing, like show. And all of those could exist as one-day events. And I don't know a lot about plants. And so I find myself continually frustrated that exhibitions are not as flexible, portable, changeable as events are. And, Kathy McLean for a long time has been asking this question, are exhibits dead? I don't think that they're dead, but I do think we have to think differently about, if we're building these assets, why are we building them in this way where they really don't travel and they really don't distribute? And I think, again, like looking at media as an analog and thinking about how does media deal with this? Whether that media be grassroots zines or whether it be huge multi-million-dollar movies, how do we think about what the greatest possible impact can be of this work that we're spending a ton of money and effort on?
All right, back to Brad.
All right.
Cool.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nina. I mean, that's a fantastic kickoff for our project. And I was just thinking, what we're doing is similarly, we want to distribute this content as widely as we can. So what's going to happen is, and this is for the YouTube audience as well, who may be out there. So we're going to take this video. Okay. So we're going to take this video and we're going to archive it on YouTube. And they say within 24 hours, Google will have this up on YouTube. And soon after that, we'll put a few highlights in there. So we want to make this video easy for people to come back to and to comment on. So that's going to be our Hive. So this is the next step in the Hive. So we just had some fantastic content that we can all think about and check back in with the website. And I'll say this for our YouTube audience, museumhive.org. So if you haven't been there yet, be sure to go there and sign up for our mailing list so we can email you little prompts to say, hey, what do you think about this? Can you submit a question, or what were your thoughts about this? And so we'll do this, we'll revisit this content and build on it again, and then create something that we'll build on the next meeting too. So fantastic. Any other final thoughts from any of the advisors, participants, final wrap-up thoughts?
We've set a very high bar for whoever's going to be the speaker for the second one.
And let's give it up for Brad Larson. Well done, everybody. Well done. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good night.
All right. So we're going to
Thanks, everybody,
actually
for coming.
hit the stop broadcast.